Hello, my name is Kaarin Goeldner. I'm a third-year nursing student at Southern Cross University. I'm also an emerging nurse leader with the Australian College of Nursing. The presentation you're about to see on imposter syndrome is a result of my research on the subject. Has also been presented at 7 national forums through the Australian College of Nursing. It is my hope that you can learn from this subject and take it on in your professional practice moving forward. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you. Have you ever had that "I'm in over my head and they're going to find out" feeling? It is an insidious and unproductive feeling of phoniness and unworthiness among people when it comes to their achievements. Even though we are highly motivated, we don't really believe any of the credit that comes our way. We are constantly looking over our shoulder for the bouncer to throw us out. I call them the fraud police. This is called imposter syndrome, and almost all of us have experienced self-doubt or one of the 4 feelings associated with imposter syndrome, which are anxiety, perfectionism, self-doubt, and fear of failure. That pretty much describes the human condition, doesn't it? I believe that you can't get rid of it completely, but you can learn to call it out and moderate it within ourselves, and we can help others to do the same. Although the feeling of being an imposter or fraud has been around for centuries, it was only in 1978 that the term imposter phenomenon was described. Rosemary Clance and Susan Imes studied successful women in America and noted that many of the women described feelings of being like a fraud. They developed a scale called the Clance Imposter Phenomenon Scale to measure this imposter phenomenon, or syndrome as we now call it. The aim of the scale is to determine whether you do not experience any imposter feelings, or if you have experienced occasional imposter feelings, or if you have a permanent sense of imposter syndrome. 70% of people experience imposter feelings at some time in their lives. I personally think that 70% statistic is a bit low. Who hasn't experienced feelings of self-doubt? Studies have shown that the higher up the intelligence ladder you go, the higher the incidence of imposter syndrome. Before we move on, it's important to understand the difference between imposters. An actual imposter is someone who pretends to have the skills, yet still attempts to perform the task. Think of Milli Vanilli, or the sign language expert at Nelson Mandela's funeral that just stood there and waved his arms about. Imposter feelings are the feelings of having misrepresented yourself, despite there being clear evidence to the contrary. Imposter syndrome, on the other hand, is a persistent set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that result from the perception of having misrepresented yourself, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The imposter cycle really is a cycle. As we go through this cycle on the slide, see if any of it sounds familiar to you. I can tell you that it is very common amongst high achievers, and especially in women, and this is what it looks like. We start at feeling like a fraud. Not okay, not good enough. Then why? We look for a reason. Then we create a reason, a target or a goal of some kind. Like, if I had a certificate, I'd feel okay. Then we work really hard to achieve that target. After that, we still feel like a fraud, but we have hope. And then we achieve the target. Then we have momentary pleasure, but the glow quickly wears off and the feeling returns. Then, before the second cycle starts, we discount the evidence shown by our achievement, deny the evidence, discount, deny, diminish our achievement in our own heads. Then we create a new reason, a new target, and on we go. So, if 70% of people experience imposter syndrome, what about the other 30%? There are people who don't have imposter syndrome. There is another interesting psychological idea called the Dunning-Kruger effect, from David Dunning and Justin Kruger in the Department of Psychology at Cornell University. Their study looked at the link between people's perception of their ability on a task versus their actual ability or competence on that task. What they found was that people who didn't do very well still tended to overestimate their level of ability. And the people who did well tended to underestimate their relative ability. What often happens in practice is that as you find out more about a topic, you begin to realize that it is quite complicated and you start to understand how much you don't know about it. Therefore, you can tend to underestimate your expertise. Ironically, people who don't know much about the topic and therefore do not understand the complexities tend to overestimate their abilities. In my experience, nursing graduates experience an enormous amount of imposter syndrome because of the Dunning-Kruger effect. To clarify, we have just spent years learning an enormous amount of material and are about to walk into a situation where our practical skills are minimal and we understand exactly how much we don't know. So let's begin with the three big questions. How does it start? What is the cost? And how can we stop it? Firstly, how does it start? There are many potential reasons for imposter syndrome, but the theory that most resonated with me is popular with several behavioral psychologists who propose the following simple statement. We don't see ourselves as similar to those around us. We feel like imposters, not because we are uniquely flawed, but because we fail to imagine how deeply flawed everyone else must also be beneath the highly polished exterior. If we go way back, the root cause can be attributed to the differences we note as very young children between us and our parents. As children, we find it impossible to perceive our parents at our age, unable to drive, cook, or go to work. As children, the gulf in status between children and adults appears absolute and unbreachable. The childhood entertainment of games and play don't look anything like the adult preferences of dining and conversation with friends. We start out in life with a very strong impression that other people, and especially admirable and competent other people, are really not like us at all. This childhood experience dovetails with a basic feature of the human condition. We know ourselves from the inside, but we know others only from the outside. We are constantly aware of our own anxieties, doubts, and idiocies, yet all we know of others is what they happen to do and tell us, which is a far narrower and edited source of information. Social media apps like Instagram and Facebook can really compound this perception. Therefore, we are left to logically conclude that we are different to others, which can then leave us racked with feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, incompetence, and fraudulence. We are simply failing to imagine that others feel the same way. Feelings are stronger than facts, but feelings are not facts. So, what is the cost? There's a very good scientific reason why imposter syndrome can affect our ability to perform as nurses. Clinical studies of imposter syndrome show that it triggers a sympathetic response, a fight or flight, which causes an adrenaline release. This is relevant because during fight or flight, cognitive reasoning, free association, and innovation is impaired. These areas are critical in nursing for effective clinical reasoning. So how do people cope with imposter syndrome? When you have imposter syndrome, you have to find ways to deal with the anxiety while you are waiting for the other shoe to drop. Some of the coping mechanisms or strategies people use are flying under the radar, not asking for promotions, not giving your ideas and sharing in meetings, procrastination, workaholism, self-sabotage. All of these coping strategies work. They do the job, but they all have a cost. If you have a significant number of people within the organization engaging in these behaviors, there is going to be a cost to the organization. On a workplace level, these coping mechanisms have an impact on staff retention and turnover, staff interactions, productivity, and the overall work environment. On an individual level, there's also a multifaceted impact, affecting resilience and decision-making, just to name two. To give you a real example of the cost, I'd like to be brave and offer a personal story. In researching this subject, I had an enormous epiphany. I realized that I changed careers and changed industries because of imposter syndrome. About 20 years ago, I worked for an extremely well-known global IT company at executive management level, and I was responsible for large teams of managers covering 25 countries. That was not the problem. The problem was that I didn't start there. In just over 4 years, after starting as a receptionist secretary in the Brisbane office, I worked my way up to the New York headquarters and global management. It was a rapid ascent through the ranks in a male-dominated environment based on hard work and in recognition of achievements. Okay, so most people would think this was pretty good going, right? Not me. Although the facts of these achievements were apparent to others, I didn't believe them. I was internalizing my self-doubts daily. I would go home to my husband saying, "It was another Academy Award performance today, darling." I felt like I was pulling the wool over everyone's eyes, even though the facts and figures said otherwise. I was denying the facts, discounting my accomplishments, and living in the imposter bubble. So, when the IT market crash happened in early 2000, entire levels of management were retrenched, and 2 out of 3 people in the whole IT industry lost their jobs. My response? They've found me out. See? Fraud police are here. I am an imposter. In my head, I was proven right and felt strangely relieved. Logically, I knew the truth that it was an economic downturn, affecting the entire industry. But because I did not recognize, overcome, or address my imposter syndrome, it won, and that had a personal cost that I didn't even realize I was paying. The end result was that I changed careers and never went back to IT. I'd like you to consider for a moment what would happen if people you worked with in nursing were experiencing imposter syndrome. And perhaps their imposter syndrome and its coping mechanisms went unrecognized. And then perhaps they experience a significant event that would cause them great stress and make their imposter syndrome a reality, and they changed careers. Now imagine what might happen in a really challenging event, causing lots of industry-wide stress, like a pandemic. We know that there is already a nursing shortage. So what could this do to our industry? Can we really afford to let imposter syndrome thrive in nursing? So how can we stop it? What works? It begins with realizing that the people who don't feel like imposters are no more intelligent or capable than you or I. According to Valerie Young, the only real difference is that they think different thoughts. In essence, if you want to stop feeling like an imposter, stop thinking like one. There are several practical actions we can do to stop imposter syndrome in our workplace. If a nurse or nurse graduate is experiencing imposter syndrome, one of the best things a leader can do is to recognize it, normalize it, and talk about it. It is very powerful when successful people admit their own doubts, especially to those who look up to them. A syndrome is a set of symptoms. So, if you notice these symptoms in someone, talk about it in a very offhand, matter-of-fact way, like, "Oh yeah, that's an imposter thing. Some of the brightest people on the planet have these feelings." Normalize it and address it. It bridges the perceived gap between those who do and don't experience feelings of self-doubt. Calling it out quietens the anxious voice inside. There is a beautiful quote by C.S. Lewis, the academic and author, who says, "Friendship is born at that moment when one person says to another, 'What? You too? I thought I was the only one.'" We should normalize imposter syndrome by making it normal and relatable. if you find yourself in a position to help someone, perhaps be brave enough to offer your own example of imposter syndrome, because in reality, we all have one. Some of the following practical tips can help to deal with imposter syndrome. 1. Know that the feeling is normal. Imposter syndrome is more common than you think. 2. Remind yourself of all that you've accomplished. Perhaps keep a journal you refer to. It's very hard to deny words written in your own hand from the heart. 3. Tell a fan. Disclose your feelings to a trusted friend. Hopefully, you'll come away with boosted spirits. 4. Seek out a mentor. Ask a senior colleague, teacher, or coach for guidance. 5. Teach and nurture. Sometimes it's only when we contrast ourselves with true newbies that we gain perspective on our own success. Remind yourself how far you've come by helping to nurture the next generation. 6. Remember, it's okay not to know what you're doing. As long as you are enthusiastic about learning, people will cut you some slack. Be teachable. 7. For children, praise effort, not qualities. Instead of "you're so smart," try "you worked so hard on that," or "you didn't give up even when it wasn't working out." 8. Expect initial failure. Like a child learning to ride a bike, you have to fall off at least 10 times before you can ride confidently. Accept the learning curve and allow yourself to be a beginner. Be kind to yourself. In closing, it's especially common for graduates and nurses working in unfamiliar work environments to feel inadequate on the transition to practice and experience imposter syndrome. If you don't address the issue, it will impact the professional development, motivation, and retention of your graduates and nurses. Recognizing imposter syndrome in each other requires observation skills, active listening, and empathy, and no one is better equipped with that skill set than nurses. If we can recognize, normalize, and discuss imposter syndrome amongst ourselves, the impact of it can be severely lessened. So here are my references. I'd encourage you to read further into this subject, as there are many great information sources available, from evidence-based journals to podcasts, YouTube videos, and TED Talks. Evidence on imposter syndrome can be found across all industries and all professions. Thank you so much for your attention and interest. I wish you all the best with your studies.